Hello, and welcome to Facts That You Never Thought You Needed to Know. In honor of Juneteenth, I have decided to do a document about the Civil War and the events that led and occurred during and after it. The United States Civil War, to be specific. Let us start with the elections that occurred prior to it. The election of 1856 was when Buchanan ran for office and won. He basically used popular sovereignty of the states and allowed them to choose whether or not to adopt slavery, following the Dred Scott decision that ruled the Missouri Compromise as unconstitutional. This was the compromise that allowed the North to be free states while the South to be slave states, while the Congress would have a balanced power of seats. Prior to the 1860 election, little people know that Lincoln was a moderate towards slavery, and he actually begged the Ohio Senator Salmon P. Chase to avoid the issue of repealing the Fugitive Slave Law in the National Republican Convention because he feared that it would fracture the party. Through his moderate approach in the Republican Party, Lincoln was able to gain the nomination instead of the extremist founder of the party like William Henry Seward. The Whig Party briefly reemerged in the form of the Constitutional Union Party with the nomination of slain owner John Bell, who campaigned to enforce the Constitution, the Union, and enforcement of laws, referencing the ignorance of fugitive slave laws. Now, John Bell was also a supporter of the Credence Compromise, which allowed people to continue slavery while pertaining the Union, and it was a last-ditch effort so that we would not go to war. The Democratic Convention was deeply divided on whether or not to support Stephen A. Douglas' enforcement on popular sovereignty, as I previously mentioned, or to support Jefferson Davis' stance on anyone being able to use their constitutional right to take slaves to various states without governmental interference. Of course, this was a belief that occurred after the Dred Scott decision that Justice Taney ruled that they could transport slaves due to the dual process clause of the Constitution, which basically treated slaves as property. Since many viewed Douglas' opposition to Kansas being admitted as a slave state as a betrayal to their cause, yet still wanting states to have popular sovereignty, the party was unable to come to a consensus in the two conventions they held. This led to the Democratic secession of the Southern states from the Union, with Lincoln and Douglas campaigning against each other in the North, and John C. Breckinridge campaigning against John Bell in the South. Breckinridge won in the South while Lincoln won the national majority and became president of the United States. As you can see in this political cartoon, you can see John Bell in the Northeast trying to patch everything together and his little compromise. And you can see Lincoln and, I believe, Stephen A. Douglas fighting it out on the left. And then you've got Jefferson Davis, who would become the future Confederate president, just tearing off a portion of the state succeeding, which would include South Carolina. Sorry. Here it is. South Carolina. The beginning of secession. Propaganda from Douglas claiming that Lincoln would make black people the social equal of white people in the southern states, especially in South Carolina, believed that the North supported the Free Soil Party's rhetoric of abolishing slavery. This led to Southern secession following Lincoln's victory of becoming president. The night of the 1860 election, a huge crowd of Charleston demonstrators demanded action against the presidential election, and the South Carolinian government responded to the convention decision of 169-0 in favor of seceding from the Union. By 1861, Mississippi, Florida, Alabama, Georgia, Texas, and Louisiana seceded as well, but their decisions weren't unanimous like South Carolina's. The finalized finalization of the division between the North and the Southern states was the decision not to adopt the Korean Compromise, made by President Lincoln based on his concrete stance of not wanting to expand slavery territory, specifically slavery territory in the West. The first battle to set it off is the Battle of Fort Sumter. President Lincoln planned to follow the advice of one of his advisors, Orville H. Browning, that stated to wait for the South to attack so it would not look like the rest of the country that the North is repelling the aggression of the traitors instead of being as unjustly policing the South. The president reestablished Fort Sumter to guard a harbor of Charleston, South Carolina from rebels in a manner similar to how President Polk sent U.S. soldiers and proclaimed Mexican territory in order to be seen as being attacked first by antagonizing the Mexican-American War once Mexican troops fired first. Seeing that this was the city in which Southern secession began, it surprisingly led to South Carolinas to not only fire at the Union supply ships, like they had previously done under the passive President Buchanan, but onto the fort itself after Lincoln's refusal to recognize Southern independence and him ordering supply ships with food and medicine to the fort. Under the leadership of Jefferson Davis, the officer of the Charleston Confederate troops, Pierce G.T. Bungard, attacked the fort with his troops and succeeded in driving the Union troops from the fort. Major Anderson's troops ran out of ammunition and food on April 13, 1861. This battle thus started the Civil War between the Confederacy and the Union. George McClellan versus Robert E. Lee. As you'll learn, the Union General George McClellan was terrible, and would even go on to run against Lincoln after his many failures in the war and after Lincoln released him from duty. Through Virginia's secession from the Union, the South gained their only capable factory of making heavy shells and armor. It was Tigger Iron Woods in Richmond, the Gosport Navy Yard, the Federal Arsenal's Harbor Ferry, and the successful General Robert E. Miller's support, who turned down the command of the Union Army in order to support the Confederacy. Lee eventually gained command of the Confederate Army of Northern Virginia, which would lead him into conflict with the Union General and Army organizer George McClellan later on in the war. Following the Union defeat in the First Battle of Bull Run Creek, Lincoln found the Army of Potomac in Maryland-Virginia line area, put George McClellan in charge of it. With the eventual numerous Union victories in the West, Lincoln would order McClellan to attack in the East. This led to the Army's focus on the Southern stronghold in the Confederacy capital in Richmond that was guarded by Lee's Army of Northern Virginia. Through General McClellan's Peninsular Campaign of 1862, troops carefully began to march and seize areas along the Virginian coast peninsula that was intended to end in draws along the Chickahominy River. In General McClellan's Peninsular Campaign of 1862, troops carefully began to march and seize areas along the Virginian coast peninsula that was intended to end in the capture of Richmond. The Confederacy threatened to be defeated, but due to the Confederate victories and draws along the Chickahominy River and Confederate General Stonewall Jackson appointing the skilled officer Robert E. Lee earlier as the commander of the Army of Northern Virginia, McClellan's troops were pushed back to the James River. Eventually, the two sides fought again in 1862 in the Battle of Manassas on Bull Run Creek, the second battle along Bull Run Creek, and Lee Stonewall Jackson yet again defeated McClellan's forces in a major victory towards ensuring the safety and stronghold of Richmond. In this war, ironclad ships would fight. The Merrimac versus Monitor, with the Merrimac being the CSS Virginia for the Confederacy and the Monitor being the Union ship. The Union controlled the Sea Islands off the coast of South Carolina by 1861, and 10,000 slaves left behind on them. Through the Union winning coastal battles, a blockade on the South ports prevented the Confederacy access to the Atlantic. The southern forts of Charleston, Wilmington, and Savannah ran through these blockades to trade with the rest of the world, specifically the Bahamas, Bermuda, Cuba, Britain, and France, but at a high financial cost that weakened the Southern economy. The closing of the Confederate ports encouraged its army to develop a defensive ironclad ship that wielded 10 protected firearms and an iron ram that could sink wooden ships. This was salvaged by the Tregner Iron Works by modifying previous USS Merrimac. It was renamed the CSS Virginia. In response to the new ship, John Erickson designed an ironclad that had raft-like features that revolving a gun turret consisting of two 11-inch guns for the Union. It was deemed the Monitor, and when the CSS Virginia sank two Union ships, it was sent in 1862 to seize it. Each side declared victory as the CSS Virginia was able to return to its designated port, yet it was driven out of Union waters by the Monitor. The ships never fought again due to the Confederate ironclad being destroyed by the Confederate troops, so it wouldn't be seized when the Union Army successfully invaded Virginia in May 1862. The Monitor sank in some gale. Literally. The Cinahl Battle. A battle that was fought at a church. How lovely. Seeing that in Corinth, Mississippi, the South's major north-south and east-west rail lines intercepted, General Grant and the Union thus attempted to disrupt the productive network. Before his forces could reach Corinth, however, Confederate forces in Tennessee attacked them near the Cinahl Church in an attempt to stop them. After 2 days of fighting, General Grant won, but both sides suffered a large amount of casualties that substantially undermined the morale of both armies. This battle showed the two separate nations that the Civil War would be a long and brutal one. Here is some information about major generals in the war. U.S. Grant would later be our president and was a major Union general. William Tecumseh Sherman was a Union soldier under Grant, and Stonewall Jackson, of course, fought for the Confederacy and, as mentioned, appointed Robert E. Lee. Ulysses S. Grant became a war hero after taking over the Confederate Fort Henry in the Navy due to Vicksburg's forces trying to gain Confederate access to the Mississippi River after David G. Farragut claimed New Orleans and southern ports for the Union. Grant was forced to spend an entire year defending the Union control of the river. This was crucial because it would split the South in half and thus weaken them. Prior to the Vicksburg situation, U.S. Grant worked with another Union general, William Tecumseh Sherman, in the Battle of Cinahl to disrupt the Southern Railroad network. By 1862, they were successful at taking over multiple Southern properties, which included the railroads despite the heavy casualties. Confederate General Stonewall Jackson defended East Tennessee and areas of Virginia against McClellan Peninsular's campaign of 1862. He would later put Robert E. Miller in charge of the Northern Virginian Army in order to protect the capital. Contraband of War. A month after the Civil War broke out, 3 slaves escaped to the Union-held Fort Monroe in Virginia and requested the commander's, General Benjamin F. Butler's, protection. Since he needed workers, he agreed and labeled them Contraband of War. This idea stemmed from the fact that U.S. laws defined slaves as private property, and international laws stated that nations may seize goods and property from other nations waging war against them. Through this idea, it became legal for slaves to flee to the Union and join their lines of work while ignoring the Fugitive Slave Act. This fortress then became a safe haven for slaves, and with some reluctance, Lincoln approved Butler's new policy. The Emancipation Proclamation. Lincoln needed support of Kentucky for strategical reasons in defending the nation's capital, so he allowed them to have slaves to gain a military advantage against the South and to simultaneously appease the abolitionist viewpoints in the North. In 1863, Abraham Lincoln passed the Emancipation Proclamation. It outlawed slavery in rebellious territories of the U.S., while still allowed slavery to occur in Union-loyal territories. New Orleans and areas in Tennessee were among the areas issued exemptions for owning slaves. The proclamation resolved the contraband issue by simply defining black people as people, and it also resolved the contraband issue by defining them as people and allowed them to fight against the Confederacy. Many black people and slaves fled to the North to support the abolitionist slavery goal of the war, which strategically increased the Union's army and supply of workers. Black people and black soldiers. More than 180,000 black males fought for the Union. This was 10% of the Army and 1/5 of America's black male population under the age of 45. This proved the Emancipation Proclamation to be military efficient as far as gaining an advantage over the Confederacy, since they, for obvious reasons of not wanting to arm slaves, couldn't use their large black populations to produce soldiers. General Grant encouraged the full inclusion of black people in the Army, and Massachusetts Governor John Andrew, with Lincoln's support, organized the 54th and 55th Massachusetts regiments that recruited free black people across the North and were led by white officers. The bounties paid to join the Union officers were appealing to the poor families, but it mattered significantly more to black people since they were fighting for their freedom as people. In 1863, black soldiers fought successfully in Louisiana and saved white troops from defeat, which secured the Union advantage of controlling the Mississippi River with its attached port, New Orleans. The 54th Regiment lost half of its number in Confederate Robert Shaw when trying to take over Fort Wagner in South Carolina. Through their fighting, black participation in the war convinced some white people, including Lincoln, that black people had the right to have rights as U.S. citizens, meaning they should be able to vote and participate equally in political processes. The Militia Act of 1862 was one exemption to this progress. Black soldiers didn't immediately gain equality in the North, despite the military making an impact on equality. White officers were initially told that any black soldiers that mistreated freedom would be dismissed from the Army no matter what their rank was. The Militia Act of 1862 was set into place due to officials believing black soldiers would be working behind the lines of the Union armies. It set the pay of black soldiers to the level of military laborers and wasn't terminated by Congress until 1864, when the 45th and 54th Regiments refused to accept pay until it was equal to white soldier payments. Black people eventually gained equal rights in court, the right to testify, and during the final months of Civil War would promote officer ranks in the Army. The MasonDixon Line. The MasonDixon Line was a settled border between the colonies of Pennsylvania and Maryland between 1763 and 1767 by the surveyors Charles Mason and Jeremiah Dixon. The line would later divide free states and slave states during the Civil War. Frederick Douglass had escaped from a Maryland plantation and became a prominent abolitionist figure in Pennsylvania, starting in the town of Chambersburg. Douglass was also secretly helping an old acquaintance, John Brown, who was hiding under the alias Dr. Isaac Smith after his role in the violence in Kansas and Harper's Ferry. A quick side note about this: John Brown massacred border ruffians during the Kansas-Nebraska Act, in which the population of that state area was meant to vote on whether or not to become a slave state or not. So he had the genius solution to kill pro-slavery advocates so that they could not vote to have the state a slave state. But in doing so, he was executed for murder. Some people believe him to be a hero, while others consider him a psychopathic murderer. That is to be determined. Frederick Douglass, he was an intellectualist. He wrote, "To what to the slave is the 4th of July?" and he believed that black people did not have the same freedom that Americans celebrated. And he was right, of course, during that time. And he helped secure a lot of support for abolitionism. Native American involvement in the war. This has been overlooked a lot in our education systems. So here's a little bit about how they were involved. Both Confederate and Union leaders sought alliances with Native Americans in their designated territories, which divided the Cherokees, Creeks, and Seminoles on who to support. Northern tribes were angry with Lincoln for ignoring treaties due to needing to invest supplies and soldiers for the Civil War that stated the U.S. provides supplies and protection for expanding white settlements. Specifically, the Santee Sioux, it's pronounced Sioux, but it looks like socks. The Sioux tribe, under the leadership of Little Crow, killed hundreds of white settlers in 1862. Minnesota, which under the leadership of Little Crow killed hundreds in 1862, Minnesota, which resulted in them being defeated and organized in the largest public hanging in U.S. history. Largest public hanging in U.S. history. It's crazy that in 1862, it was because Native Americans were angry at the expansion of white settlement during our Civil War. In 1863, Shoshanshi, under Chief Bear, attacked white settlers in the Utah and Idaho territories to stop white settlement expansion, but they were also defeated by the Union. As white and Native American relations deteriorated, the Union became preoccupied by protecting its territory from them, despite some minority tribes fighting against the Confederacy due to sympathizing with the Northern abolitionist viewpoint. Battle of Chancellorsville and General Stonewall Jackson. In 1863, Union General Hooker and Confederate General Stonewall Jackson fought for 7 days in Chancellorsville, Virginia. Stonewall Jackson won when he ordered his troops around the end of Union lines and forced Hooker to retreat. This became a major Confederate victory, but at the high cost of 10,000 casualties, including Jackson being accidentally fired at by his own troops and dying of those injuries a week later. After the Union lost 14,000 troops in the battle without a victory, Lincoln replaced General Hooker with General George Meade. You'll find that it's a common pattern that Lincoln replaced generals. And with the glorious presidents that McClellan left with many losses and retreats, you can't expect that to happen until Grant takes charge. Also, I want to point out the hilarious irony that a Confederate general nicknamed Stonewall Jackson for not allowing Union forces to penetrate into Confederate territories, nicknamed Stonewall, was shot at by his own troops. It was interesting. The Battle of Gettysburg. Following the victory in the Battle of Chancellorsville, Robert E. Lee convinced Confederate President, that should be Jefferson Davis, that their army should immediately invade the northern cutoff of Washington, D.C. from the rest of the Union and end the war successfully. During Lee's campaign, his army took all black people as prisoners, claiming that they were fugitive slaves, as seen notably in the town of Mercersburg. The Northerners feared that the massive Confederate army from coming from the Philadelphia countryside and taking over Philadelphia or Washington, so Lincoln ordered the Army of Potomac to stop Lee's advances. The army met at Gettysburg, and eventually the Confederacy would force the Union troops to Cemetery Hill, where they would hold their ground. Pickett's charge, named after the officer leading the unit, was successful at deteriorating the Union's position despite their heavy losses. Robert Lee eventually retreated to Virginia, and since Meade didn't pursue the troops like McClellan, Lincoln replaced him with Grant. Grant's siege of Vicksburg. General Grant had just returned from a victory in Vicksburg in 1863 after blocking resources from reaching the Confederate port. Through saving the residents, he Through starving the residents, he forced them to surrender to the Union and single-handedly won the North complete access to the Mississippi River, splitting the Confederacy in half. He replaced McClellan in the Union General of the Potomac Army. There's a picture of him. Actually, this is a later picture of him when he became a U.S. president. Unfortunately, he was a terrible president due to his obsession with alcohol, to put it lightly. Gettysburg Address. This was a speech that President Lincoln gave after the battles of Gettysburg to raise Union morale, as it was a heavy loss with a lot of deaths. The Civil War was a limited war at the start, in which McClellan and Meade retreated when the Confederate forces fled, but when Robert E. Lee and Grant became fighting, it became a war of attrition, which is the process of gradually reducing the strength and effectiveness of something through sustained attack and pressure. So here are some examples. The lack of medical treatment made the war deadlier as far as the technology and ironclad. The production of rifle also stopped the traditional close order stance, as armies were extremely vulnerable to the long shooting guns. Once Grant pursued the Confederate forces and took control of the Crossbows town, Grant issued a counterattack on them, but suffered high casualties of 13,000 to the Confederacy's 2,500 in report.